All right, it is 12:02, so we can go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stephanie McCowett. I'm the marketing manager here at DATAMARK, and welcome to our fifth webinar of the year, Navigating NENA Standards, where we review the GIS Data Stewardship document for Next Generation 911. I am very excited to introduce you all to someone you probably already know if you've been to any of our other webinars, Jeff Ledbetter. Jeff, do you want to give yourself a quick intro?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. I own the title of webinar famous, so I know if you've joined very many of our webinars, it's more than likely you've heard me going on and on about things I go on and on about. But I'm glad to be here today and to present on this topic. You know, we've been talking a little bit. We did a couple of months ago. We did a more generic introduction to NENA standards at large, and we indicated then that that would just kind of be the tip of the iceberg, the first in a series of different webinars about NENA standards. And so we want to take our first dive into, and it will take more than one to get through the GIS data stewardship document for sure. We'll step our toe into a couple of the initial topics of that GIS data stewardship document today. So appreciate your joining us and look forward to sharing some information about that. I'm going to preserve my bandwidth and go ahead and turn my video off and make a couple of introductory remarks in regard to what we're going through today. First of all, I'll mention that I'm dealing with a little bit of a summertime cold, so I may do some sniffling and coughing, and I'll apologize for that in advance, but I've got my water here handy to get us through that problem. Secondly, I'll just acknowledge right up front that basically all the words on the slides today are words from the data stewardship document. Kudos to the working group that put it together. They did such a great job of giving good, concise language about these topics that we're going to be talking through, that it was hard for me to kind of like break it down or rephrase it in any way that was meaningful. So let's just consider all the words on the slides, quotes from the document. And then the other note I'll make about what you'll see on the screen is that it is very text heavy, and that's not always the way I like to go for webinars. But again, the words are so well put together, so well crafted, and concise and descriptive of what we're going to talk about, that I just felt like it was an appropriate way to handle this topic. And in the future series, we're going to put a little more time and effort into maybe figuring out some more graphics, more meaningful graphics for some of the things. But some of the topics too are kind of esoteric GIS topics that don't necessarily have great opportunities for graphics. So again, I'll just acknowledge that the words, it's very text heavy, and that the words are the documents, but we'll talk about and make some comments about it. Finally, before we get into the content, I'll just note that these things are likely to bring lots of great questions and discussion about the topic, the particular topics we're going to get into. And so I want to encourage that and invite that. And if you have anything to say or ask about any of the things that I bring up, please do so in the chat. Feel free to populate the Q&A, and I'll do my best to answer those things as I can. Steph will be there to monitor that Q&A and chat as well. So I'll ask her to just let me know if there's anything that you feel like needs to be answered at the time. Go ahead and break in on my conversation, and we'll address that if you see anything pop up. So again, we always have great participation in the chat, so I just want to continue to encourage that for today's webinar as well. So let's jump right into the content here. Again, as I mentioned, we'll be going through the NENA information document for GIS data stewardship for Next Gen 911. You see on the right-hand side the definition of stewardship, right? And so I really love that we called it GIS data stewardship from a NENA perspective. It is the conducting, supervising, or managing of something, right? Which is GIS data for Next Gen 911. And then we'll talk specifically about two sections of the document. The first is stewardship of GIS data used by the ECRF and LVF, and the second is general requirements common to all data layers, GIS data layers. And before we jump into the content on those specific sections, I'll also just remind everybody that this is an information document that NENA has put out, and I'll just draw the distinction between an information document, which is advice and best practices, up against the backdrop of a standard, which is normative in its language and gives the shalls and musts, gives directions and the unifying standard that about GIS data. So there is, in this document, it is a breakdown of how to maintain GIS data for NG901 based on the standard. So I've got a QR code here that if you scan it, you can download the document itself. The most recent document was published in 2023. The document number NENA INF 028.2. And if you're seeing it on the NENA website, you'll see a -2023 to indicate the date it was published. But it covers the following topics: data sets needed and how they are used, quality measures such as completeness, accuracy, and topological consistency, the need for coordination and best practices for data exchange, recommendation and guidelines for managing NG901 layers, specific recommendations for creation and maintenance of service boundary layers, and then specific recommendations for creation and maintenance of civic location layers. So you can tell from the list of topics, and again, this bullet point list came straight out of the executive overview of the document, that this is going to be a vital document to anybody who's looking to create and maintain GIS data for NG911. It was written to an audience of GIS and PSAP staff involved in 911, and I point that out because it's not only the GIS people that it's written to, but it's also the 911 authorities, and we'll dive into the details on that here in just a few minutes. But it's also geared at those PSAP staff too. And so, sometimes, like recently I sat through a presentation made, a really fascinating presentation made by somebody who was what I would call a radio propeller head, right? Somebody who really knew radios the way that I really know GIS. And some of it was hard to sit through because, they were going into the weeds about radio stuff that I couldn't comprehend, frankly. It wasn't anything about the presenter. It was about my ability to really understand what he was saying. And I said to the crowd afterwards, because I got up and did a GIS presentation, I said, I think I figured out, after sitting through a really great presentation by somebody who's an expert in the field, but in a field that I don't really know, I figured out what it's like for a network guy to sit through a GIS presentation. And so this document, I tell that story because this document is really geared not only for the GIS nerds, but also for the PSAP, the 911 authorities, to understand what they're responsible for. And again, we'll talk about those responsibilities here in just a minute. The second point that I'll make about the audience and intent of this document is that it takes an in-state perspective, right? And that's really important to me because I've co-chaired the working group that has produced, and hopefully that document will be published soon and we can go over it in this series of webinars, but a document that specifically addresses transitional GIS data management for NG911 as well. And so some of the things that you'll read in this document, all the things that you'll read in this document are geared at what the GIS data needs to look like to be properly consumed in an in-state NG911 system. And, loosely defined, I'll just say that an in-state NG911 system is one that is in an EZNet and fully utilizes the capabilities of geospatial call routing in NGCS, as well as, though this document doesn't really focus on that because it's really specifically not about NG911, but then the other advanced capabilities of other call handling, mapping, CAD type systems down the road. Where what this document doesn't really address and the GIS data transition document does address, is during that period of overlap between we're kind of beginning to get to end state, but we're not all the way there. What does your GIS data need to look like? So this is the target that you're trying to hit in terms of what your GIS data needs to look like and what it needs to do in that end state. But there are other considerations around the transitional period of time that I'll point out this document does not address. So the current version includes, and if you've been in the NENA circles, if you go to conferences like Standards and Best Practices, you've heard about this for years as this great working group has been doing its work, is that right now it covers service boundaries for PSAPs, service boundaries for response agencies, and road center lines. What's not really addressed in there, but will be in future versions, is site structure address points, though there is an INF about site structure address points. And there's currently some consideration by the DSC at NENA, the steering committee that drives the document development process, as to whether or not there needs to be an update to the current SSAP document, or that needs to be subsumed into this GIS data stewardship document. My suspicion is that that'll be what winds up happening, but I'm a terrible fortune teller, so who knows. I'll just leave this slide by kind of quoting again out of the executive overview on page 2, what I felt like was a really good bit of content here on the right-hand side. A program of GIS data stewardship is not limited to the initial creation of data. It involves regular access to tabular inputs such as civic addresses and regular maintenance of spatial data such as service boundaries and road center lines. Ensuring that the data used by the NG911 system are complete, accurate, and current may require cooperation between multiple data contributors and stakeholder agencies. A comprehensive data management approach includes not only continual data input and maintenance, but also ongoing communication between stakeholders. I mean, you really can't put together 3 sentences to tell the work and job of anybody involved in GIS data stewardship for NG911 better than those 3 sentences, in my opinion. The data needs to be complete, accurate, and current, and it is going to take a village, if you will, of various stakeholders to create and continually maintain the appropriate GIS data for these systems. So I really felt like that was a great sentence and worthy of repeating. So let's get into the stewardship. This is section 3 of the document, stewardship of GIS data used by the LVF and ECRF. Actually, I'll back up just real quick and say that if you're not up to speed on the acronyms, don't want to leave anybody behind. The LVF, the location validation function, is a pre-call function that validates location for service provisioning. And the ECRF is the emergency call routing function that actually gives the location and the route to the emergency service routing proxy, the ESRP, so that it can move the call to the next IP hop and get it to the right PSAP. So in this section, we're going to talk about the roles and responsibilities and coordination duties between those groups, the aggregation of 911 data layers. This is a major topic, right? It's huge, but I'll say that it's probably not very well understood, because most of the people being tapped to do a lot of the work really live at a local level and less at a regional or a statewide level. And so I want to give you some insights from the document about why that aggregation is important and some considerations around maintaining data that needs to be moved up to a regional or statewide data set of aggregated data. And then briefly touch on data synchronization, but it's actually not that much about data synchronization. It's It's more about a few tips, a couple of tips here about topology and snap to points that are good recommendations. So let's talk about that GIS data provider roles and responsibilities. You know, in the early days of this, these standards, in the early days of these INF documents, there was a big debate about whether or not we call a GIS data provider anything besides that, right? We have the 911 authority, do we also have the GIS authority? And I think the right choice was made to stick with a more generic term of GIS data provider, because in who is a GIS data authority, so to speak, varies wildly across the country, across the world. Is it the party that creates the data? Is it the party that owns the data? Is it the party that is some sort of data quality steward? Maybe all of those things. It may be one of those things, but this broader term of GIS data provider, I think, is more appropriate, because ultimately, as we'll talk about on the next slide, the 911 authority is really the only one that is an authority in this particular framework or construction. And they typically don't have the expertise and skills to maintain a GIS data set. And so they need some help from somebody, or a set of potential somebodies, right? That maybe we call a GIS data provider. A GIS data provider may create and maintain the original source data and or aggregate, right? So that's an important note as well, is that you would still be a GIS data provider even if you're bringing together other GIS data providers' products or data sort sets into an aggregate GIS data set, whether it is at a city that you're aggregating, you know, multiple entities such as the planning department versus the public works department versus, you know, the assessor. It doesn't matter. Or if you're aggregating data from several other data providers, such as at a county level, maybe you're providing the county the data for the unincorporated county, but you're bringing together data from cities, various cities. This GIS data provider, at some level, must work with NENA authority to determine the appropriate GIS data sources, and may provide civic location data for all or only a portion of the service boundary area. As I mentioned, maybe some that are in municipalities versus unincorporated counties or other areas of responsibility. In this role, this GIS data provider would have a role of being responsible for performing quality control checks on the data within their area and ensuring it conforms to NENA standards. So this, I think of the GIS data provider role, I think of as the party with the know-how to create and maintain GIS data. And then the 911 authority is the party with the responsibility to ensure that this data is created according to the standards and in a way that works with their NGCS provider. And I think that's one of the greatest lessons that, as we've walked with some of our clients through some of the processes of onboarding into NG911 systems and creating data sets for that ahead of time, some of the greatest lessons we've learned is that standard is an important starting point, but it is not the ending point, because your NGCS providers may have requirements that are, while compliant with the standard, a little bit different or beyond the standard. And so that 911 authority role really needs to be aware of those things, because they are responsible for it. They may be a state, county, regional, tribal, or other governmental entity responsible for 911 service operations. It is pretty amazing how across the US, and then if you fold in various international locations, the way to get this done in terms of who is that 911 authority and at what level do they reside and how do they work together with the levels above and below them is wildly different, right? So I worked for Greater Harris 911 in the Houston area of Texas, and we were a special district where we had a board that we reported to, but we provided the 911 network, but we were not a PSAP or a collection of PSAP, but we serviced our clients or customers ultimately were those PSAPs. And so we were a regional entity at that point, serving multiple cities, multiple counties, multiple levels of entities, providing just the 911 network. And so because of that, we had a lot of GIS data needs and concerns, but we were not the PSAP, right? We were not the GIS data provider. We were the 911 authority. In other places, the 911 authority is a PSAP itself at the PSAP level, and each PSAP is doing its own thing. What I think of when somebody says to me, we're a home rule state or a home rule city, I think that means that they're probably responsible for provide. They are the PSAP, but they're also the 911 provider and authority as well. And that goes to the second bullet point there. They may be composed of more than one PSAP. Excuse me. They may assume the role of GIS data provider. So this is another interesting dimension of the puzzle, the 3D chess that we're playing here, is that 911 authority may be the GIS data provider as well, because they may hire a staff that belongs to the PSAP, to that special district, to the county, to the state, whoever, to actually be the GIS data provider. Or, and I think this is probably in the majority of cases, they may delegate that function to another entity, such as the local GIS shop, right? Maybe it's somebody out of the assessor's office, maybe it's somebody out of the public works office, maybe it's the IT department, but they may delegate those duties to other providers. And I think it's important, these last 2 points, is that the 911 authority, I think this is something that a lot of people that sit in the seat of the 911 authority may not fully comprehend or appreciate, but they're actually responsible for the GIS data that's put into play and responsible for the quality of it and the appropriateness of it and the fact that it routes to the right PSAP really sits on their shoulders, even though in more cases than not, like a vast majority of them, they may not have the skills to actually know, to actually perform the data control quality that they need. But what they do need to know is how to specify exactly how and by whom local data will be reviewed and edge matched, and to specify how boundary issues are resolved and how final quality control measures are performed before the data are provided to the SI. That's intimidating to a lot of 911 authorities because when it comes to like networking and telephony and call handling equipment and all the different technologies used in a PSAP, they're really comfortable and confident and proficient at being able to specify things about how those things are done. But when it comes to GIS, they largely view it, most of them largely view it as kind of the black box that sits in the corner. And so there's a lot of trust that has to be built between this 911 authority and the GIS data provider or providers. And I think as GIS professionals, we should take on the mantle here of ensuring that the 911 authorities that we work with are confident about our ability to create and maintain the data in the way it needs to be created and maintained, and that you got their backs, right? And so that coordination between these two roles is really critical. And so on page 12, it quotes something along these lines, right? In all cases where multiple GIS data layers are being aggregated by a higher level agency to a third party, an agreement with the GIS data providers and 911 authority is recommended. That's kind of a heavy statement, right? Okay, so now we need to go ahead in the most ideal cases, we would be able to document the requirements and document the parties and document the processes that need to take place. And the text further clarifies by saying the agreement should define who is authorized to edit the GIS data, identify types of changes allowed to by each entity, and outline the process to notify each party when changes are implemented. All discrepancy reports resulting from NG911 system operations should be communicated by the system operator, that is your NGCS provider, if you will, to the entity designated by the 911 authority to resolve discrepancies for a given provisioning area or service area. And that may be a little bit stiffer on the collar, but I would echo that thought that where you can, if you're a 911 authority, you want to specify as much of that in documented forms as possible. And an agreement is a great idea if you can, get that put together. On the next topic, the aggregation of NG911 GIS data layers to regional or statewide data sets. It states kind of some of the benefits and reasons why this aggregated GIS layers are part of the design. Right? It improves database integrity across the state or region by having a common schema, ensures common coordinate system within the state prior to providing the layer to the NGCS. And enables the creation creation and application of consistent topology rules across the aggregated data set. So I'll point out here that it says state, but it may be region too, right? It may be even a county, whatever. Whatever level you're aggregating up to, it provides this database integrity. It provides the ability and opportunity to consistently apply topology rules and a consistent coordinate system, which is critical in NG911. See a Q&A before we move forward too far. How often is legislation created to support the recommendation to have agreements between data providers and other stakeholders? I'm not aware of any regulatory requirements to have such agreements in any states or places, but it's really just sort of a best practice recommended here because it documents things and ensures that everybody's clear on their jobs and the expectation of the data. Good question. Okay, back to aggregation of data sets. What are we doing? There we go. So the thing about aggregation is that, and we'll talk about unique IDs here in just a minute, but it illustrates the point being made here on this slide and in the document that there is an opportunity to homogenize data from different providers that have different requirements for their own business systems, to homogenize their schema, make sure that their coordinate systems are homogenized as well, and to be sure that there is this common data set for NG911 systems. So the GIS data synchronization is the section title, and it does do a fair job of concisely defining synchronization between legacy databases and GIS databases. But again, I'll point out there is a transition document that should be published hopefully this summer that's going to focus more in that area. But I pulled these two sections out because I think these are really good in-state tools to ensure that the goals of that GIS data aggregation that we just talked about are achieved. So again, I'll just quote from the document here on page 14 about topology. It says topology describes the spatial relationships between GIS features, that is road center lines, such as road center lines within service boundaries, and must be considered when developing or maintaining NG911 GIS data layers. When a specific relationship between features is desired, topology rules need to be developed to enforce that relationship. Um, yeah, topology is something that means different things in different places, but in a GIS sense, it is really a data QC tool, and preserves, as it says, these spatial relationships between features, and make sure that they are in conformance with the intentions of the systems that consume the data. So topology is a great tool to use, and a set of rules that'll help you maintain your GIS data quality. What there was not in this section was specifics about how those topologies should be configured. And the reason is because your NGCS providers have different rules of the data that they consume and utilize. And so there is no way to create one set of requirements for topology. So you'll have to work with your NGCS providers very closely to be sure that your topology rules create conformant data to their needs. The next topic of snap 2 points is one that I think makes a lot of sense, that probably very few entities out there are actually using, but again, really useful tool to use to be sure that you create high quality GIS data for NG901. Snap 2 points, also known as anchor points, agreement points, stitch points, edge points, you can come up with lots of names for it, represent where data from one GIS data provider ends and another begins. It ensures coincidence and edge matching across borders and between GIS data layers. This is really a unique NG901 requirement, right? Because before these requirements came to be, there was really no need to make sure that my data lined up with my neighbors, because we both lived in an island and we had our own needs and purposes for which we created this data to service the city or county or state or whatever it was that we were servicing. And the final bullet point, I'll point out that the creation of snap 2 points, excuse me, snap 2 points can serve as a focal point to facilitate maintenance discussions along these boundaries. So the idea of a snap 2 point is that we create a whole new feature class of points where we all agree that if something happens to the data, if it shifts in transforming coordinate system or anything else, this is where they're supposed to meet, right? This is where data from my GIS ends and yours begins, neighbor, right? So there's lots of different ways to do it. There's not a standard schema, right? But the point is that as long as we have that geographic location nailed down, if something happens to your data or something happens to my data, we can always come back to this one point where we agreed. We do a lot of boundary facilitation conversation with lots of our clients, and we recommend the creation of these points. And I'm sure in some cases we've actually created for our clients as well, these snap 2 points. So I'm a big believer in that concept, and to share it out of the document here. Okay, before I go on, a couple more questions. Can you get this presentation? Yes. So as all of our webinars are, we make them available via YouTube channel. So in a couple of days, you'll get an email with the link to the recorded presentation. So if you need anything in addition to that, definitely reach out. I'll have my contact information at the end. Next question, is there any effort underway to identify a preferred level of precision to minimize artificial errors from being created in reprojection? Yes, we'll have some slides on that here in just a second. So great question. Next question, how to ensure coincidence and edge matching across borders between GIS data layers, who defines the service boundaries, county coordinators, if we find there are errors, gaps, and overlays, who do you contact to correct it? And what is the design of PSAP polygons? Well, PSAP polygons is definitely an in-depth topic that we'll have to cover in another time, but I'll refer you to, I'm certain, across our many webinars that are recorded on our YouTube channel, There's some good guidance as to that. And then I'll point out in your question in terms of who do you send any errors that are found, who corrects those, and how do we create this coincidence and edge matching. That's the point of that coordination of the roles, right? And that if you're not coordinating, you don't know who to send it to fix it. The data owner really has to be the one that fixes things, which would be the GIS data provider. But the 911 authority's responsibility is to ensure that it meets their needs. And another question here, must all data be delivered from the county/regional GIS data provider, or is there an option for state provincial entities to supply data that exists at that level? Yeah. For example, poison control in Ontario, Canada. Yeah, there's definitely appropriate data from appropriate people, right? There we go. Yeah, and some boundaries come in at a city level, some boundaries at a county level, states or provinces, as this example gives in Ontario. The provider of the next gen core services needs to know where to send the call, right? And so there is no distinction to them as to who should provide that data, as long as it's an authoritative provider of data, right? And so that would be my advice, is that if the provincial government is the authoritative supplier of data, and that can coexist and commingle with authoritative data from a local level, that is altogether appropriate as long as the NGCS provider can work with that. So that's a generic answer, but I think gets at the heart of the question there. Thanks again for the questions. Okay, moving on. I know we're only got a few minutes, and so we may have to punt to the next opportunity on some of these topics, but I'll get down to it. The use of coordinate systems is a critical one, right? The standard, the I3 standard, calls for all GIS data to be provisioned in WGS 84. However, I know of very few, if any, local GIS authorities that are maintaining data in WGS 84. So this transformation must occur, right? The second bullet point, while local GIS data may be kept in any geographic or projected coordinate system, it must be transformed into WGS 84, either by GIS data provider or the SI provider. And so that's something that will vary widely, as well as who's responsible for transforming that data. Well, it may be the SI, it may be the NGCS provider through that SI. And that makes a lot of sense when that occurs. However, the onus and responsibility on the GIS data provider is to be sure that they've gone through sufficient QA/QC checks to be sure that when it gets transformed and there is some distortion in the location, that it doesn't screw up the requirements of the NGCS, right? And so we all know, as GIS professionals, as it points out here in the last bullet, that transformation and reprojection is likely to introduce errors, right? So choosing a locally appropriate transformation process will minimize errors and reduce the chance of creating unintended overlaps and gaps. The transformation process will vary depending on the native projection and the GIS software used for data development and maintenance. And isn't that interesting? When you use an Esri ArcGIS Pro versus a QGIS or some other GIS software to perform a reprojection, sometimes you get different results, right? Because I can't fully explain it or comprehend it myself, much less explain it, but sometimes you get different results. And I think we've probably supported some clients through some of these issues where the NGCS provider used an open source data package, but they're using an Esri data package. And even though they're moving to EPSG coordinate systems, so that there is the theory of this sort of like uniform algorithmic transformation that happens, sometimes things just shift different, and there's no like fully defining or putting your finger on why that happens. But the point is that as a GIS data provider, you're your responsibility is to be sure that you understand everything that you can about how it gets transformed, and so that you can provide data that once it's transformed, it works, right? And there's a little bit of latitude in what it means to quote unquote work, right? So um, you'll have to coordinate not only closely with your 911 authority, but also your NGCS provider to be sure that when this transformation takes place, your data performs appropriately. The NGUID is a fascinating topic. Man, boy, we get into some nerd conversations with these things, and I love them, right? But they can get complicated. So every feature in each GIS data layer must be assigned an NGUID. The second bullet point, I'll just read the quote. The NGUID differs from other unique identifiers as it's designed to completely differentiate each feature submitted by a GIS data provider from any other feature that could exist within a consolidated nationwide data set. The NGUID is comprised of multiple elements. And so I'll make this point. You have a unique persistent ID in your database. That's awesome. And you need to have that from a good data management practices perspective. However, for data that goes into an NGCS, Next Gen Core Service system, and an NG91 routing system, it has to have a separate, unique, persistent ID that may be based on your unique persistent ID in your database, but has to be specifically called out as this NENA globally unique ID. And it is for the reason that's cited here. Because as your data is pressed together and aggregated with other GIS data sets, there has to be a way to ensure that we know exactly who owns that piece of data, and we know which piece of data in their database it corresponds to, so that when discrepancies occur, the system providers can communicate those discrepancies, that the GIS data providers that get the notification of those discrepancies can identify which records need to be adjusted in order to fix the discrepancy, right? And so that's the critical feature of the NGUID is even once it gets theoretically into a statewide database, a national database, some year in the future, possibly an international database, because there can't be another record that duplicates that, say, address points, for instance. You have to have an NGUID that identifies who owns the data and what record it corresponds to in that local database. This is all accomplished by, on the third bullet point, the local unique ID. And again, I'll just read from the text. A unique ID is an independent attribute created and maintained by the GIS data provider used to uniquely identify a specific record in a database. The GIS data provider generates a locally assigned ID, which can be numeric or text. Right, that's critical. It's pretty flexible. It can be numeric or text. This local ID must be unique within the GIS data provider's data set for all features associated with a specific agency identifier. The process to generate this ID can be manual or automatic. So there's lots of ways to kind of mix the dough and bake the bread, but it has to, at the end of the day, be a certain type of loaf of bread, right? That's the NGUID. Couple of tips on page 16 about creation and maintenance of these NGUIDs, critical component to the database. So this is a really great section of the document. The NGUID creation and maintenance should be coordinated and documented and processed between all parties involved. The NGUID maintenance process may differ based on GIS data workflows within various levels of maintenance hierarchy. The NGUID may not need to be maintained at the most local level, but may be managed at an aggregating level. Interesting, right? So maybe in the case of a local entity that doesn't really have the bandwidth to manage these IDs, maybe there's a regional or statewide aggregator persona that is creating these IDs. That's advice given in this document. Interesting, right? But a stable, and I included this fourth statement because I think it's just a really important one. that a stable and persistent local unique ID is strongly recommended as it serves the basis for NGUID creation, regardless of the level of which the NGUID is maintained. Stable and persistent is the key. And the persistent local unique ID supports tracking errors, as I said, as back to their source. And caution should be used when using an automatically generated unique ID. Interesting caution there, right? Automatically generated unique ID, as they're not always persistent. And the example of that to me is a Esri global ID. They are very unique and very stable and very persistent within the database. But if that database, once that database moves out of that Esri SDE or whatever software is hosting it, the potential for it to no longer be stable, persistent, and unique is there. And so you just have to be sure that your process of creating these and maintaining these is tested, is appropriate, and is creating a stable and persistent unique ID to that database. Horizontal accuracy is a topic that will blow a lot of people's minds in these circles. There is efforts to kind of clarify this in the GIS data model working group, as I understand it. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on horizontal accuracy or vertical accuracy for that matter, but it's worth mentioning because there are requirements in the data model. Those requirements are likely to be clarified a bit in the next version. But it's important to note that they should be meeting the standard of the National Spatial Data Infrastructure's National Standard for Spatial Data Accuracy. And vertically, it's an interesting note that they make here, and I'll just echo it. That based on evolving standard regulations and technological capabilities, it can be expected that it will become increasingly frequent that accurate vertical elevation/elevation information will be arriving at PSAPs. Okay, there's already an FCC rule that requires carriers to send Z-axis information from a device. And based on that, right, there will need to be some sort of GIS-based context given to that vertical information, that Z-axis information. How do you operationalize Z-axis information coming in from a carrier? That's a challenge these days because I think the FCC was a little bit out in front, and this document notes that by saying, look for more guidance in a future version. There wasn't even enough guidance to kind of create and give in this version of the document. So as that changes in the GIS data model, in version 3 of the GIS data model, it will also be updated in the GIS Data Stewardship document to reflect whatever changes occur there. And in database precision, that is, it says when merging data from different GIS databases, differences in the precision value of the GIS databases may create slivers and gaps when consolidating the data into an LEF and ECRF. Currently, NENA has not established a standard for GIS database precision. So another thing just to pay attention to is that if you're getting some weird unintended slivers and gaps in your polygons, especially when it goes into an SI, this may be a point at which you can troubleshoot that and make sure that the databases that are contributing to the aggregated data are aligned on precision. And then metadata, it's everybody's favorite topic to ignore, but it is well addressed here. When maintaining metadata, it is important to document any limitations or constraints of the data. So I'm the last one to try to enforce anybody from keeping good metadata, because when I was a data creator, my metadata was basically non-existent, and if it existed, it sucked. So the point though is exactly pointed out here, right? The most important thing to do in that metadata is to document any limitations or constraints of the data. You know, it was, I'll just read the second check mark here. It's important that the origination and/or stewardship level of GIS data layers can be determined from an overview snapshot of the metadata. As GIS data layers are regionalized or combined, metadata should be updated to reflect the respective level of collection while the contributing GIS data layers are archived, ensuring specific contact information for each data layer remains available through the aggregator and through the aggregator. So it's critical as we start merging and mushing together GIS data sets that we can track back to who owns the data, how it was collected at some level, and what how to get in touch with those people to resolve discrepancies that may come up. And so I kind of ran through that last bit fairly quickly because I wanted to leave some time for Q&A. So we got
All
about
right.
8 minutes here.
Jeff, we got a few questions in the Q&A, so I'll just go ahead and start.
Okay, cool.
If that's cool. All right. So from Rodney, at any point will third-party nav providers such as Google Maps, Apple Maps, or Apple Maps be required to coordinate with addressing authorities? Our biggest challenge is constant complaints that every driver or other services vendors can't find their new road or address.
Yep. That's I hear that a lot. So I'm not aware of any regulatory requirement for any of those data providers to do any checking with any authoritative data providers, right? And from an NG901 perspective, I certainly don't see any future regulation coming out from those requirements. But I'll just say that that is a coordination step that I have seen some progress towards from some of the providers. For instance, Google over the last year or two has made some efforts to better consider authoritative data sources over crowdsourced data sources in terms of being able to contribute your data and have it update their maps. But I don't see any big regulatory requirement coming down the road. But that complaint is pretty pervasive among our clients as well, that they hear from people. Well, UPS can't deliver my packages because of the way the GIS data is put together. But I don't see NG901 creating a regulatory requirement for that. Okay, I'm taking a look here as well, Steph. Any characters prohibited in the NGUID? I'm going to punt on that question because I would need to do a little bit of research to give you the right best answer. So I'm not going to wing that one. Maybe, Mary, I would suggest just drop me an email on that if you need an answer, a real good answer on that, and I'll make sure to get you one. An example of a feature in this context. I'm not sure the context that was given there, but generally when I refer to a feature, I'm talking about an address point in a road center line. Yep, and I'll leave it there. A polygon boundary, right? Let's see the next one. The SI needs to set an acceptable level of precision that is not 100%. A gap or overlap of 1 inch on the ground is meaningless and should be acceptable. Yeah. So this is a big conversation, right? We spent many hours with our SI trying to identify the source of an artificial error. I agree with you. Not only that precision level, but even just a tolerance, right? And I think tolerance is the solution. There has to be a certain level of tolerance as you point out, there's a gap or there's an overlap of 1 inch. We can deal with that, right? We can live with that. There is the GIS data model and the stewardship document references a horizontal accuracy that roughly equates to plus or minus 13.89 feet. But what does that actually mean in terms of operationalizing data into an ECRF that can deal with that? I'm not sure, and that's why within the community there's a big discussion about whether or not that needs to remain in the standard, and if it's a meaningful standard, anyways. So I'll agree with you, and the answer is your NGCS provider should be able to give you a tolerance that's acceptable, because you're right, 100% is not going to happen. Does each 911 authority get assigned a unique code or name? So there is the discrepancy agency ID. There's also an agency ID that each 911 authority will have within that NGCS provider system. But I don't think there's any requirements that NGCS provider systems ensure that those are unique necessarily either. So I would defer to an NGCS provider for that question if you need a specific answer. But I would say I would lean on those, the discrepancy agency ID and the agency ID is where those unique codes would exist. Coordination pathways. I'm not sure what that's 100% in reference to. Default ARC cluster tolerance. Ooh, yes, 0.001 meters. That's pretty tiny, right? So that tolerance again is the key to making things work. What's the acceptable tolerance? It probably needs to be more than 1/1000th of a meter. What do I mean by SI? An SI is a spatial interface. Sorry if I jargon that one up a little bit too much, but a spatial interface is where GIS data is provisioned to a next-gen core service provider system. It's usually provided by that NGCS provider so that it knows where to put the data on the inside once it gets there. Hopefully that was helpful. Mini mapping and delivery companies. Okay, good. Use the NAD. Yeah, the NAD's an interesting topic for sure. There's contact information on that site. Yeah, the NAD aggregates data from states about address points. And yes, that is definitely used by lots of different entities. As a 911 authority, aggregating data from authoritative GIS source providers, what is the NENA or the FCC's take on who is ultimately responsible for data quality and accuracy if there's no written agreement between them? So, according to, I believe I'm correct in this, but I'm gonna hedge my bet a little bit. I may be telling you the wrong document, but I believe that it is. I believe it is the I3 document. It may well be STA 005, which was the one about provisioning data to an ECRF or LVF that is currently under revision and will no longer be a standard once that revision is complete. But it states that the 911 authority is ultimately responsible for the quality of the data and the construction and content of the data, which is where that complication comes in, is that most 911 authorities themselves aren't proficient in GIS and don't understand the issues. And so in more cases than not, they'll delegate that out to a competent GIS professional. So it looks like that's all of, one more. Oh, the context. Yep. There's been some movement. Oh, yeah. The follow-up was, do you know a method for that coordination? Yeah, so send me an email, Rodney. I can track down the particular presentation that I'm thinking about occurred at the ERISA LEAP conference, either this year or last. I don't recall exactly, but I can track that down for you and send you a link to a YouTube video. But Google has made some efforts to open up consideration from authoritative data sources. Yep. Yeah, so that goes for everybody, right? If you have any specific questions that I wasn't able to answer, or if I kind of fired a synapse for you, but wasn't able to close the loop, please feel free to reach out to me. Here's my email address and my phone number. Fire away, and I'll be happy to support to the extent that I can.
All right, and just one final thing to say before we head out and wait for our other webinar happening next month. But this webinar was recorded. We will follow up with the recording after the session, probably within 1 to 2 days. Our team will have a very exciting announcement coming out probably next week. So stay tuned for that. And thanks so much, Jeff. And thanks everyone who joined.
Yeah, thanks for your time, everybody.